October 21st, 1916, 8,000 feet above Bapaume, France. Second Lieutenant Lenox Hawker, Britain's first great ace with 7 confirmed victories and a Victoria Cross on his chest, found himself in a duel that would last 35 minutes and cover 20 miles of sky. His opponent was a 24-year-old German pilot named Manfred von Richthofen, flying his first combat patrol as a section leader. Neither man could have known they were writing the rulebook for aerial combat, inventing tactics that would define fighter warfare for the next century. When Hawker's DH-2 finally spiraled into a frozen field near Louisast, von Richthofen circled overhead, watching British soldiers recover the body. He later wrote in his combat diary that Hawker was a brave man who had turned to fight rather than flee, and that killing him had been the hardest fight of his career. This moment, when chivalry met industrial slaughter 2 miles above the trenches, captured everything about World War I aerial combat, the last gasp of individual heroism in an age of mechanized mass death. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, aviation was barely 11 years old. The Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk had lasted just 12 seconds and covered 120 feet. Military strategists viewed aircraft as curiosities, expensive toys that might have some limited reconnaissance value, but would never replace cavalry for scouting or artillery for killing. The French Army owned 15 aircraft in 1909. The British Royal Flying Corps, formed in 1912, had exactly 63 planes when war began. Germany's air service possessed maybe 250 aircraft total, most of them fragile observation machines that could barely reach 60 miles per hour. None of these early military aircraft carried weapons. The idea of aerial combat didn't exist because nobody could imagine how it would work. The first military aviators were volunteers from cavalry and infantry regiments, men seeking adventure and escape from the grinding monotony of traditional service. They learned to fly in machines built from wood, wire and fabric that killed student pilots with disturbing regularity. The Blériot monoplane, a popular training aircraft, had a nasty habit of shedding its wings in flight. The B-2, the British Army's standard reconnaissance plane, was so stable it was nearly impossible to manoeuvre, which would later make it a death trap when enemy fighters appeared. These early machines had no instruments beyond a compass and altimeter. Pilots navigated by following roads and rivers, estimated airspeed by watching the ground scroll past, and landed by feel. Engine failures were common, crashes were routine, and survival depended more on luck than skill. When war erupted in August 1914, aircraft were immediately pressed into reconnaissance duty. British and French pilots flew over German positions, sketching troop movements and artillery emplacements. The intelligence proved valuable enough that both sides began flying daily observation missions. On August 22, 1914, Captain L.E.O. Charlton of the Royal Flying Corps spotted German General von Kluck's First Army wheeling southeast toward Paris, exposing its flank to French forces. This single observation helped enable the French counterattack at the Marne that saved Paris and prevented Germany's planned quick knockout blow. Military commanders suddenly realized that aircraft could provide information worth more than entire cavalry divisions. The problem was that enemy aircraft could do the same thing. The first aerial combat was almost comically improvised. Pilots carried rifles, pistols, even bricks and grappling hooks, anything they could throw or shoot at enemy planes. On August 25, 1914, 3 British aircraft pursued a German observation plane, and Lieutenant Harvey Kelly forced it down by flying so close the German pilot panicked and landed in a field where the crew was captured by British cavalry. The first confirmed kill using a firearm came on October 5, 1914, when French pilot Joseph France and his observer Louis Canot shot down a German aviatic with a Hotchkiss machine gun. The German crew died in the crash, making them the first men killed in aerial combat. Within weeks, both sides were mounting machine guns on 2-seater observation planes, creating the first dedicated fighting aircraft. The problem was synchronization. Early aircraft had the engine in front, driving a propeller that would be destroyed by bullets fired through it. The solution seemed obvious: mount the gun to fire around the propeller arc, but this limited firing angles and made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Some designs mounted guns above the upper wing, firing over the propeller. Others used pusher configurations with the engine behind the pilot. The French developed deflector plates, armoured wedges on propeller blades that deflected bullets, though this reduced propeller efficiency and sometimes caused dangerous ricochets. Every solution was a compromise until a Dutch aircraft designer named Anthony Fokker solved the problem with Germanic efficiency. Fokker, working for Germany, developed an interrupter gear that synchronized machine gun fire with propeller rotation. A mechanical linkage connected to the propeller shaft prevented the gun from firing when a blade passed in front of the barrel. The system was simple, reliable, and transformed aerial combat overnight. In July 1915, Fokker's EI monoplane entered service with German units on the Western Front. It was not a particularly impressive aircraft, slow, poorly armed with a single machine gun, and difficult to fly. But it could fire forward, directly along the pilot's line of sight, turning the entire aircraft into an aimed weapon. For the first time, a pilot could point his plane at an enemy and pull the trigger. The impact was immediate and terrifying. German pilots discovered they could approach British and French observation planes from directly, ahead or behind angles where the observers' defensive guns couldn't reach them. Lieutenant Max Immelmann and Lieutenant Oswald Bölker, flying Fokker EIs, began systematically destroying Allied aircraft. Between August and October 1915, German fighters shot down 40 British planes while losing only 3 of their own. Allied pilots called it the Fokker Scourge. British squadrons were told to fly reconnaissance missions only in formations of at least 3 aircraft. With multiple observers to provide defensive fire, it didn't help. The Fokkers picked them off anyway. Oswald Bölker became the first true fighter tactician. He studied every combat, analysing what worked and what didn't, and in 1916 he wrote down his conclusions in what became known as the Dicta Bölker, 8 rules for aerial combat. Secure advantages before attacking. Always carry through an attack once begun. Fire only at close range and only when your opponent is properly in your sights. Always keep your eye on your opponent and never let yourself be deceived by ruses. In any form of attack, it is essential to assail your opponent from behind. If your opponent dives on you, do not try to evade his attack but fly to meet it. When over enemy lines, never forget your own line of retreat. For formations, attacks should be made in groups of 4 or 6, and when the fight breaks up, beware of 2 attacking 1 opponent. These rules, written in 1916, remained valid for fighter combat through World War II and beyond. Bölker had invented fighter tactics from first principles in less than a year. The Allies responded with desperation and innovation. The French deployed the Nieuport 11, a nimble biplane with a machine gun mounted on the upper wing to fire over the propeller. It couldn't match the Fokker's forward-firing capability, but it was faster and more manoeuvrable. The British introduced the DH-2, a pusher design with the engine behind the pilot, allowing a forward-mounted gun with an unobstructed field of fire. By spring 1916, new Allied fighters were arriving in numbers, and the Fokker Scourge was ending. German technical superiority had lasted just 9 months before Allied production and innovation overwhelmed it. April 1916 marked the beginning of massive aerial battles over Verdun, where the French and Germans were grinding each other into mud in the longest battle of the war. Both sides deployed hundreds of aircraft, turning the skies into 3-dimensional battlefields. French ace Georges Guynemer, flying a Nieuport, shot down his first German plane on March 5, 1916. He would claim 54 victories before his death, 18 months later at age 22. German pilot Max Immelmann, who had terrorized Allied pilots during the Fokker Scourge, was killed on June 18, 1916, probably by ground fire, though British pilot George McCubbin claimed credit. The life expectancy of a combat pilot was now measured in weeks. New pilots arriving at the front were often dead before their belongings arrived. From the supply depot, the summer of 1916 brought the Battle of the Somme, and with it technological escalation that would define the rest of the war. Britain deployed the Sopwith Pup, a delightful little fighter that pilots loved for its gentle handling and forgiving nature. France introduced the Spad 7th, fast and sturdy with a powerful Hispano-Suiza engine and twin Vickers machine guns synchronized to fire through the propeller. Germany countered with the Albatros D2, a sleek biplane with 2 synchronized machine guns and a streamlined fuselage that gave it superior speed and firepower. For the first time, fighters had enough power and armament to be truly deadly. A 2-second burst from twin machine guns put 40 bullets into a target the size of a piano. Aircraft didn't just fall when hit, they disintegrated. Manfred von Richthofen, transferred from the cavalry to aviation in 1915, initially flew as an observer before training as a pilot. He showed no particular talent until Oswald Boelcke personally selected him for a new fighter squadron in September 1916. Boelcke taught Richthofen his dicta, emphasizing patience, positioning and marksmanship over aerobatics. Richthofen's first victory came on September 17, 1916, when he shot down a British Fe-2B over Cambrai. He ordered a silver cup engraved with the date and opponent, beginning a tradition he would continue until silver shortages made it impossible after his 60th victory. By the end of 1916, Richthofen had 15 confirmed kills and was developing the methodical, ruthless approach that would make him the war's deadliest pilot. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was catastrophic for British aviation. Germany deployed improved Albatros fighters, the D3 and DV models with superior speed, climb rate, and firepower. The British were still flying obsolete aircraft, particularly the C-2, which was so stable it couldn't manoeuvre and so slow it couldn't escape. During April 1917, a month British pilots called Bloody April, the Royal Flying Corps lost 245 aircraft and 211 pilots killed or missing. German losses were 66 aircraft. The average life expectancy of a British pilot at the front fell to 11 days. New pilots were arriving with less than 20 hours of flight time and no gunnery training. They were thrown into combat against German veterans who had been fighting for years. The slaughter was systematic and industrial. Manfred von Richthofen, now commanding Jasta 11, a squadron of elite German fighters, shot down 21 British aircraft during April alone. His unit claimed 89 victories in a single month while losing only 2 pilots. Richthofen had painted his Albatros D3 bright red, making himself instantly recognizable. It was a gesture of supreme confidence, inviting combat and daring enemies to face him. British pilots called him the Red Baron, a name that combined respect and terror. Richthofen's tactics were simple and brutal. He positioned his formation between British lines and the enemy aircraft, forcing his opponents to fight or flee toward German territory. He attacked from superior altitude with the sun behind him. He always assigned multiple fighters to attack bombers and observation planes, while he personally hunted enemy fighters. He never took unnecessary risks, breaking off attacks if conditions weren't favourable. His goal was not glory but efficiency, maximum enemy kills with minimum German losses. The British responded with better aircraft and improved training. The SE-5A, entering service in March 1917, was fast, sturdy and well armed, with a synchronized Vickers gun and a Lewis gun on the upper wing. The Sopwith Camel, arriving in June 1917, was a handful to fly, killing more British pilots in training accidents than Germans shot down in combat. But in skilled hands, the Camel was deadly. Its rotary engine created massive gyroscopic forces that made it viciously quick in right-hand turns. Camel pilots learned to use this characteristic, baiting enemies into turning fights where the British plane's peculiar handling became an advantage. By summer 1917, the Allies had fighter aircraft that could match or exceed German types in performance. French Georges Guinemet, flying Spads, became a national hero despite his frail health and nervous temperament. He was rejected for military service twice before the war due to his weak constitution, but once in the air he was fearless to the point of recklessness. On May 25, 1917, he attacked 8 German aircraft alone, shooting down 2 before his guns jammed and he was forced to flee. He painted a crane on his aircraft fuselage and flew with such aggression that German pilots learned to avoid the crane emblem. On September 11, 1917, Guinemet took off on a patrol and was never seen again. His body was never recovered. The French government announced that he had flown so high he could not come down, a poetic fiction that helped morale. In reality, he was almost certainly shot down by German pilot Kurt Wissemann over Poelcapelle, Belgium. His aircraft crashed in an area that was obliterated by artillery in subsequent fighting, erasing any trace of plane or pilot. British ace Albert Ball, who had accumulated 44 victories by age 20, died in May 1917 in circumstances that remain disputed. He was last seen diving into clouds while pursuing a German aircraft and crashed in a field near Anneux in France. German records credit Lothar von Richthofen, Manfred's brother, with shooting him down, but the evidence is inconclusive. Ball may have become disoriented in the clouds, suffered mechanical failure, or simply been hit by ground fire. The death of aces like Ball and Goinemer demonstrated that skill and experience provided no guarantee of survival. The sky was too vast, combat too chaotic, and luck too fickle. By late 1917, the nature of aerial combat had evolved from individual duels to coordinated group tactics. The Germans organised Jagdstaffeln, hunting squadrons of 12 to 14 fighters, into larger formations called Jagdgeschwaders that combined up to 4 squadrons under a single command. Richthofen took command of Jagdgeschwader 1 in June 1917, leading nearly 50 fighters that could concentrate overwhelming force at critical points. His unit became known as the Flying Circus because pilots painted their aircraft in bright, individualised colours, and the entire squadron moved frequently along the front by train, like a travelling show. The psychological impact on Allied pilots was devastating. Encountering the Flying Circus meant facing Richthofen himself, plus dozens of experienced German aces flying superior aircraft. The Allies developed their own formation tactics. British squadrons began flying in loose groups rather than tight formations, allowing pilots to watch each other's blind spots while maintaining flexibility. The French pioneered the patrol line, where fighters spread across several thousand feet of altitude, creating layers that could support each other when combat began. Captain James McCudden of the British Royal Flying Corps became an expert in formation leadership, positioning his flight to attack from superior altitude while keeping track of every pilot and maintaining an escape route. McCudden survived to claim 57 victories, a remarkable achievement that owed as much to his caution and tactical sense as his marksmanship. American pilots began arriving in France in late 1917, initially in small numbers and flying French aircraft. The Lafayette Escadrille, a squadron of American volunteers flying for France before the United States entered the war, had been in combat since 1916. These men brought enthusiasm but little training, and losses were heavy. Raoul Lufberry, an American ace with 17 victories, tried to teach new pilots the survival skills he'd learned the hard way. Stay in formation. Never dive after an enemy without checking above you first. If you're hit, head for home immediately. Don't try to continue fighting. Fire in short bursts to avoid jamming. Many ignored the advice and died within days. January 1918 brought new German fighters that briefly restored German air superiority. The Fokker WWI triplane, made famous by Richthofen, was exceptionally manoeuvrable though not particularly fast. The Fokker Dieven biplane, arriving in April 1918, was possibly the finest fighter aircraft of the war, combining speed, climb rate, high-altitude performance, and gentle handling. Allied pilots reported that the Dief seemed to hang on its propeller, climbing at angles that should have caused a stall. German pilot Ernst Udet called it the best machine ever built, a sentiment shared by many on both sides. The Dief was so effective that the Treaty of Versailles specifically required Germany to surrender all D-7s to the Allies, the only aircraft mentioned by name in a peace treaty. On March 21, 1918, Germany launched Operation Michael, a massive offensive aimed at breaking through Allied lines before American reinforcements could arrive in decisive numbers. For 5 days, German forces advanced up to 40 miles, the deepest penetration since 1914. Aerial combat reached unprecedented intensity as both sides threw every available aircraft into the battle. Richthofen's Flying Circus flew multiple sorties daily, strafing British troops and engaging in continuous dogfights with British and French fighters. The Red Baron's victory count reached 80, more than any other pilot of any nation. But the strain was showing. Richthofen had been wounded twice, suffered from headaches and depression, and looked exhausted in photographs from early 1918. Friends noticed he no longer talked about victories with enthusiasm, but spoke of duty and obligation. On April 21, 1918, Richthofen was leading a patrol over the Somme Valley when his formation encountered Sopwith Camels of the Royal Air Force's 209 Squadron. The German fighters dove to attack, and Richthofen pursued a Camel flown by Lieutenant Wilfred May, a novice pilot on his first combat mission. May's commanding officer, Captain Arthur Roy Brown, dove to rescue his wingman and fired a burst at Richthofen's Fokker triplane from behind. Simultaneously, Australian machine gunners on the ground opened fire at the low-flying German aircraft. Richthofen's plane lurched, turned toward German lines, and made a rough landing in a field near Vaux-sur-Somme. Soldiers reached the crashed triplane within minutes and found Richthofen dead in the cockpit, killed by a single bullet that had entered under his right arm and passed through his chest. The question of whether the fatal shot came from Brown's guns or from ground fire has never been definitively resolved. The bullet's trajectory suggests ground fire, but Brown received credit for the victory, and neither the Germans nor the British had any interest in diminishing the story of the ace killed by another ace, rather than by anonymous infantry. The Allies buried Richthofen with full military honours, recognising that he had fought cleanly according to the era's standards of chivalry. Australian soldiers crafted a wreath with the inscription, "To our gallant and worthy foe." Richthofen's death sent shockwaves through both the German air service, which lost its most famous pilot and most effective tactician, and Allied squadrons, where pilots felt relieved that the greatest threat they'd faced was gone. Richthofen's legacy extended beyond his 80 victories. He had professionalised fighter combat, transforming it from individual heroics into coordinated team tactics. His emphasis on patience, positioning, and overwhelming force rather than aerobatic showmanship became the template for successful fighter operations for the rest of the war and beyond. The final months of World War I saw aerial combat at its most intense and deadly. By summer 1918, hundreds of fighters clashed daily over the Western Front in battles involving 50 or more aircraft. The Americans were finally arriving, in significant numbers, bringing fresh pilots and new aircraft. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, a former racing car driver, became America's top ace with 26 victories. Frank Luke, a wild Arizona pilot who specialized in attacking observation balloons, despite their heavy ground defenses, shot down 18 balloons and aircraft in just 17 days before being killed on September 29, 1918. The French ace René Fonck ended the war with 75 confirmed victories, possibly more than Richthofen, though his claims have been disputed. British ace James McCudden, one of the most thoughtful and skilled fighter pilots of the war, died stupidly in July 1918 when his engine failed during takeoff and he attempted to turn back to the airfield, stalling and crashing. It was exactly the kind of mistake he'd warned others never to make. The technological progression from 1914 to 1918 was staggering. Aircraft speeds increased from 60 miles per hour to over 140. Service ceilings rose from 10,000 feet to over 24,000. Armament evolved from pistols and rifles to twin synchronized machine guns firing counter 200 rounds per minute. Engines grew from 50 horsepower to over 200, but the human cost remained constant. Of approximately 14,000 British pilots who served on the Western Front, over 6,000 were killed. French aviation casualties exceeded 5,000. German losses topped 5,000. American losses, despite their late entry, reached over 600. These numbers don't include the thousands more who were wounded, taken prisoner, or psychologically broken by the strain. The armistice on November 11, 1918 ended the fighting, but not the influence of World War I aerial combat. Every air force in every subsequent conflict studied the lessons learned between 1914 and 1918. The importance of altitude advantage, concentration of force, aggressive offensive tactics, skilled marksmanship and group cohesion, all proven essential by pilots like Boelke, Richthofen, Ball, Goinemer, and Rickenbacker. Fighter pilot training incorporated their hard-won wisdom. The legendary aces became templates for martial excellence, their tactics studied and their aggressiveness celebrated. But there was a darker legacy. The war had revealed that aerial combat selected for a specific psychological profile men who could kill without hesitation, endure constant stress without breaking, and maintain aggressive confidence in the face of statistical certainty that they would eventually be killed. Most fighter pilots never shot down an enemy. Studies after the war revealed that roughly 5% of pilots accounted for 40% of victories. These elite killers possessed a combination of excellent eyesight, quick reflexes, fine motor coordination, spatial awareness, and critically, the predatory instinct to hunt and kill other humans without moral hesitation. Manfred von Richthofen embodied this type perfectly. He kept careful records of every victory, ordered trophies made to commemorate his kills, and spoke of shooting down enemies, with the detached language of a hunter discussing deer. There was no malice in his killing, but no mercy either, just cold efficiency. The romanticism surrounding World War I aces, the image of chivalrous knights jousting in the sky, was partly true and partly propaganda. Pilots generally didn't attack men in parachutes, though parachutes weren't issued to most Allied pilots until late in the war because commanders feared pilots would abandon their aircraft too readily. Opponents who landed safely were treated courteously if captured. Pilots on both sides respected skilled enemies and mourned their deaths. But this chivalry existed within a framework of industrial slaughter. The same pilots who saluted worthy opponents also strafed trenches, machine-gunned retreating troops, and bombed hospitals and towns. The clean image of aerial combat, far above the filth and horror of the trenches, was an illusion. Pilots burned to death when their aircraft caught fire. They fell from damaged planes without parachutes, sometimes taking minutes to hit the ground. They died from infected wounds in primitive field hospitals. They went mad from the strain and were quietly reassigned or institutionalized. In 1935, Ernst Udet, the German ace who survived the war with 62 victories, was asked about his combat experiences. His response captured the complexity of World War I aviation better than any propaganda. "We were all terrified, all the time. Anyone who says they weren't is a liar. You learned to function despite the fear, to push it down and do what needed to be done. But it never went away. I saw friends die in ways that haunt me still, burning, falling, exploding. And I killed men, young men like myself who'd done nothing to me personally except be born in the wrong country. We told ourselves it was glorious and honourable because the alternative was to admit we were simply murderers with better equipment. The truth is that aviation warfare was exactly like trench warfare, brutal, random and pointless. We just had a better view while we died." The surviving aces of World War I carried their trauma in different ways. René Fonck became a businessman and politician in France, rarely speaking of his combat experiences. James McCudden was dead before the war ended. Eddie Rickenbacker survived to become an airline executive and World War II hero, living to age 82. Billy Bishop, the Canadian ace with 72 victories, became an effective recruiter for the Royal Canadian Air Force in World War II, despite questions about whether he'd exaggerated his combat record. Hermann Göring, a capable German pilot with 22 victories, who took command of Richthofen's Flying Circus after the Red Baron's death, became Hitler's second-in-command and architect of the Luftwaffe before his eventual war crimes conviction and suicide. Ernst Udet, the gentle pilot who survived 62 combats, committed suicide in 1941 after the pressures of developing aircraft for the Luftwaffe became unbearable. The numbers from World War I aviation tell a story of rapid innovation meeting human fragility. Approximately 50,000 aircraft were built for combat use between 1914 and 1918. Over 20,000 were destroyed in combat or accidents. Roughly 15,000 aircrew were killed on all sides. The average lifespan of an aircraft at the front was 3 weeks. The average lifespan of a combat pilot was 2 months. These statistics represented individual tragedies, young men who had volunteered for the newest and most thrilling form of combat, only to discover that technological progress meant only that death came faster and more certainly. When World War I ended, the surviving pilots returned home to a world that viewed them as heroes without understanding what they'd endured. They'd fought in a form of combat that was simultaneously intimate and impersonal, killing men they could see clearly through gun sights while never hearing their voices. They'd mastered machines that represented the cutting edge of technology, while using tactics that would have been familiar to cavalry officers a generation earlier. They'd experienced fear and exhilaration in measures that ground soldiers couldn't imagine, fighting in 3 dimensions where a moment's inattention meant death. And they'd survived when most of their comrades had not, bearing the guilt and trauma that survivors of any war carry forever. The legacy of World War I fighter pilots echoes through every conflict since. The tactics they developed, the culture they created, and the mythology they inspired shaped military aviation for the next century. Modern fighter pilots still study Bölker's dicta. Air forces still emphasize aggressive offense, superior positioning, and concentrated firepower. The image of the lone ace, the gifted pilot who transcends ordinary skill through natural talent and killer instinct, remains central to fighter pilot culture. And the lesson that Manfred von Richthofen learned during his duel with Lenoir Hawker, that survival depends on patience, positioning, and ruthless exploitation of any advantage, remains as true in the age of supersonic jets and missile combat as it was in 1916 when biplanes fought with machine guns. The final irony is that the individual skill and courage of World War I aces, the qualities that made them legendary, were already obsolete even as they fought. The war's outcome was decided not by heroic pilots, but by industrial production, resource allocation, and the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy. Germany had many skilled pilots, but couldn't build enough aircraft or train enough replacements to match Allied numbers. The Allies lost more pilots and aircraft in absolute terms, but their advantage in production and training meant they could sustain losses that would have crippled Germany. By 1918, the average German fighter pilot had perhaps 20 hours of training. The average Allied pilot had 40 to 60 hours. Quality couldn't compensate for that. Disparity, not when multiplied across hundreds of pilots. So when we remember Manfred von Richthofen circling above the field where Lanau-Hawker died, acknowledging the courage of a worthy opponent, we should remember the full context. Both men were killers shaped by industrial warfare. Both were products of a military culture that celebrated aggression and sacrifice. Both died violently, Hawker in 1916 and Richthofen 18 months later, killed by the same impersonal mechanisms of modern war they'd helped create. Their duel wasn't the last gasp of chivalry, but the first demonstration of how technology had made aerial combat another form of industrialized slaughter. The sky had become a battlefield, and the men who fought there discovered that height provided no escape from the grinding logic of 20th century war. They'd turned fear into legend through courage and skill, but in the end they were just more casualties of a conflict that consumed an entire generation. The transformation of aerial combat from individual duels to systematic destruction accelerated through 1918 as both sides learned that survival required abandoning romantic notions of fair fights. Captain James McCudden, writing in his memoir published posthumously, described the evolution with brutal honesty. When I started flying in 1916, we still believed in giving the other fellow a sporting chance. By 1918, we'd learned that sporting chances got you killed. The goal was simple: destroy as many enemy aircraft as possible while losing as few of your own. If that meant 10 of us attacking one of them, we did it without hesitation. Honour was something for politicians to discuss. In the air, there was only survival and victory. The methods fighter pilots developed to maximise kills while minimising risk became increasingly sophisticated and ruthlessly practical. French ace Charles Nungesser, who survived the war despite being shot down multiple times and accumulating injuries that left him requiring a cane to walk, pioneered the technique of attacking from directly below, where enemy observers had limited visibility and defensive guns couldn't depress far enough to return fire. British squadrons adopted the practice of assigning specific roles within formations. The best marksmen flew as shooters, focusing exclusively on getting kills. Less skilled pilots flew as watchers, protecting the shooters from surprise attack. New pilots flew as bait, deliberately exposing themselves to draw enemy fighters into traps where veterans waited above. The psychological toll of this systematic approach to aerial killing manifested in ways that military doctors didn't understand. Pilots developed elaborate superstitions, refusing to fly without lucky charms, insisting on specific aircraft, following rigid pre-flight rituals. Some became reckless, volunteering for every patrol and attacking any enemy regardless of odds. Others froze, finding excuses to abort missions or developing mysterious ailments that kept them grounded. French pilot Georges Madon, who finished the war with 41 victories, spent 3 months in a military hospital in 1917, being treated for what doctors called nervous exhaustion, but what we would recognise as combat stress reaction or post-traumatic stress disorder. The arrival of large numbers of American pilots in spring and summer 1918 provided the Allies with a resource Germany couldn't match. Fresh, aggressive pilots who hadn't been ground down by years of combat. But American enthusiasm came with a deadly learning curve. The 94th Aero Squadron, the first American unit to see combat flying their own aircraft rather than French planes, lost their commanding officer on their first patrol when Major John Huffer was shot down and killed within minutes of crossing the lines. His replacement, Captain James Hall, was shot down and captured 3 weeks later. The third commander, Captain Kenneth Marr, lasted 5 days before being wounded and evacuated. Eddie Rickenbacker, who eventually commanded the 94th, survived by applying the methodical approach he'd learned as a racing car driver. He studied enemy tactics, kept meticulous notes on aircraft performance and weapons characteristics, and refused to take unnecessary risks. His first victory didn't come until April 29, 1918, nearly a month after his squadron began combat operations, because he spent that time learning to survive. When he did start scoring victories, they came in rapid succession because he'd mastered the fundamentals. Attack from superior altitude with the sun behind you. Get close before firing within 50 yards if possible. Fire in short bursts to prevent jamming. Break off immediately if the attack fails. Never follow a German aircraft down into a dive toward German lines where their friends might be waiting. These rules, variations of Belker's dicta, had been proven by 3 years of combat. Pilots who ignored them died. The tactical innovation that defined late-war aerial combat was the coordinated squadron attack, where 15 to 20 fighters worked together to overwhelm enemy formations through superior numbers and positioning. German Jagdgeschwaders perfected this approach, with different sections assigned specific roles. Top cover prevented enemy fighters from diving on the formation. Attack elements engaged enemy fighters. Special sections targeted bombers and observation aircraft. The entire formation moved as a coordinated unit, concentrating overwhelming force at the point of contact. Allied squadrons adopted similar tactics, though British and French commanders emphasized flexibility over rigid doctrine, allowing individual flight leaders to adapt to circumstances. The evolution of aircraft technology through 1918 focused on incremental improvements rather than revolutionary changes. Engines became more reliable, reducing the mechanical failures that had killed so many pilots. Gun synchronization systems improved, decreasing jams and increasing rate of fire. Ammunition quality got better, with fewer duds and more consistent ballistics. Aircraft structures were strengthened to handle the stress of combat maneuvers. These small improvements added up to significant advantages. A 1918's Sopwith Camel was perhaps 30% more capable than a 1917 model, not through dramatic redesign, but through hundreds of minor refinements based on combat experience. The psychological impact of aerial combat on ground troops deserves examination because it reveals how aviation changed the nature of warfare beyond simple military effectiveness. Soldiers in trenches watched dogfights overhead, with the same fascination that medieval armies might have watched jousting tournaments. When a German aircraft fell in flames behind Allied lines, soldiers cheered. When one of their own planes went down, the effect on morale was devastating. Infantry lived in constant fear of artillery and machine guns, threats they couldn't see or fight. But they could see aircraft, could watch the fights, could identify with pilots who seemed to be engaging in a cleaner, more comprehensible form of combat. The reality that those pilots were just as likely to die horribly as any infantryman didn't penetrate the mythology. German military leadership recognized by mid-1918 that they were losing the air war not through inferior tactics or courage, but through simple mathematics. The Allies were producing more aircraft than Germany could destroy, and training more pilots than Germany could kill. German factories were struggling with raw material shortages and labour problems. Aviation fuel quality declined as petroleum supplies dwindled. Pilot training was cut to dangerous minimums as experienced instructors were recalled to combat units. By August 1918, German fighter pilots were entering combat with less than 15 hours in type, meaning they'd spent fewer than 15 hours actually flying the specific aircraft they'd taken to battle. Allied pilots were arriving with 50 to 100 hours in type. The skill gap had reversed from 1917, when German veterans had faced British novices during Bloody April. The final German offensives in summer 1918 saw aerial combat reach peak intensity. On August 8th, the first day of the Allied 100 Days Offensive, over 800 Allied aircraft supported the ground attack, providing reconnaissance, attacking German positions, and engaging in massive dogfights with German fighters trying to interfere. A British pilot described it as being in a swarm of angry bees, with aircraft everywhere you looked, all trying to kill each other. The sky was full of tracers, smoking aircraft, and parachutes from observation balloons that had been attacked. You couldn't track individual combats because there were too many happening simultaneously. You just picked a target, attacked, and hoped nobody was attacking you while you were focused on them. The emergence of specialized ground attack squadrons represented aviation's evolution from purely aerial combat to integrated battlefield support. British and French units equipped with armoured aircraft carrying bombs and additional machine guns focused exclusively on attacking German trenches, supply columns, and artillery positions. These missions were more dangerous than fighter combat because pilots had to fly low and slow through intense ground fire. Losses were catastrophic. Some ground attack squadrons lost 50% of their aircraft in a single month. But the military effect was significant enough that commanders continued the missions despite the casualties. German troops reported that Allied air attacks made daylight movement nearly impossible and forced them to conduct most logistics operations at night. Frank Luke, the American balloon buster who became famous for his reckless courage, exemplified both the best and worst aspects of fighter pilot culture. Observation balloons were critical targets because they directed artillery fire, but they were also death traps for attackers. The balloons were surrounded by anti-aircraft guns, protected by fighter patrols, and the observers could parachute to safety while the attacker had to fly through a wall of ground fire. Luke attacked balloons with suicidal aggression, often diving through the defensive fire to ensure a kill. He would then strafe the German trenches on his way out, daring the defenders to hit him. His commanding officers considered him insubordinate and reckless. His fellow pilots considered him insane, but in 17 days of September 1918, he destroyed 14 balloons and 4 aircraft, a killing spree that made him temporarily the most successful American pilot. On September 29, 1918, Luke took off without authorization to attack 3 balloons near Mouveau. He destroyed all 3 in the face of intense ground fire, then strafed German infantry positions before his aircraft was badly damaged. He crash-landed in a field near Mouveau, wounded and with his plane burning. German soldiers called for him to surrender. Luke drew his pistol and fired at them before being killed by return fire. He was 21 years old, his body was recovered after the war, and he was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. His story encapsulates the self-destructive heroism that aerial combat cultivated, a willingness to embrace almost certain death in pursuit of mission accomplishment and personal glory. The final weeks of the war saw experienced pilots on both sides exhibiting symptoms of what we now recognize as combat fatigue. Ernst Udet wrote in his diary that by October 1918, he was having difficulty sleeping, experienced tremors in his hands, and felt overwhelming dread before each mission. He continued flying because not flying would mean admitting weakness, something the culture of fighter aviation couldn't tolerate. French ace René Fonck, who remained coldly efficient through the end of the war, was described by comrades as having dead eyes, emotionally disconnected from the killing he performed with mechanical precision. British pilots developed elaborate drinking rituals to cope with stress, with some squadrons reporting alcohol-related problems that would have resulted in disciplinary action if commanders hadn't recognized that pilots needed some outlet for the psychological pressure. The German Revolution in November 1918 and the subsequent armistice ended combat operations before the Allies could fully exploit their overwhelming numerical and technological advantages. German squadrons were ordered to cease offensive operations on November 10th, and the armistice took effect at 11 a.m. on November 11th. Some pilots flew final patrols that morning, encountering each other but holding fire as the agreed ceasefire time approached. Others remained on the ground, unwilling to risk death in the war's final hours. A few died anyway, shot down in the minutes before 11 a.m. by pilots who either didn't know about the armistice or decided to take one last opportunity for a kill. The statistical analysis of World War I aerial combat reveals patterns that military organizations spent decades trying to understand. Of approximately 19,000 Allied pilots who saw combat, roughly 6,000 were killed and another 3,000 were wounded or taken prisoner. German losses from approximately 10,000 combat pilots included about 3,500 killed and 1,500 wounded or captured. But these casualties weren't evenly distributed. The majority of pilots never shot down an enemy aircraft. A small minority, perhaps 5%, accounted for roughly 40% of all victories. An even smaller group, the 50 or so aces who scored more than 20 victories, were responsible for perhaps 15% of all kills. These elite pilots possessed a combination of natural ability, extensive training, combat experience, and psychological characteristics that made them exceptional killers. Manfred von Richthofen's 80 victories, the highest total of any pilot in the war, came from approximately 300 combat patrols over 18 months. This means he averaged a victory every 3.75 patrols, a kill rate far higher than even other successful aces. His tactical approach emphasized patience and positioning over aerobatic skill. He studied his opponents, learning to identify different aircraft types by silhouette and predict their likely maneuvers. He positioned his formation to maximize advantages in altitude, sun position, and proximity to friendly territory. He personally selected targets, usually choosing isolated aircraft or those already engaged with other German fighters. His marksmanship was exceptional, with most of his kills achieved at ranges under 50 yards, where even mediocre shooting would be effective. But Richthofen's success also depended on factors beyond his control. He commanded elite units composed of experienced pilots flying excellent aircraft. He had access to the best mechanics, ensuring his aircraft were properly maintained and his guns functioned reliably. He operated over sectors where German ground forces could recover downed Allied aircraft, confirming his victories. He survived long enough to accumulate victories when most pilots were killed within weeks or months of entering combat, and he received credit for victories in circumstances where multiple German pilots fired at the same target, something that was standard practice but meant his official total might overstate his individual contribution. None of this diminishes his skill or courage, but it contextualizes his achievements within a system designed to create and publicize aces for propaganda purposes. The Allied ace system worked differently. British pilots had to have victories confirmed by ground observers or other pilots to receive credit. This meant many probable kills went unrecognized because they occurred over German territory, where confirmation was impossible. French confirmation requirements were similarly strict. American pilots initially received credit based on their own claims, leading to significant overcounting that was later corrected. The result was that Allied victory totals are probably more conservative than German totals, though both sides had pilots who exaggerated or fabricated claims. The pressure to be an ace, to achieve the 5 victories required for that designation, led to optimistic interpretations of inconclusive combats and outright fabrications that comrades were reluctant to challenge. The psychological profiles of successful aces revealed uncomfortable truths about what made effective killers. Most showed limited empathy, an ability to compartmentalize the humanity of their opponents. They described shooting down enemies in mechanical terms, talking about destroying aircraft rather than killing pilots. They exhibited high levels of aggression, actively seeking combat rather than avoiding it. They demonstrated confidence that bordered on arrogance, believing in their own superiority even when evidence suggested luck played a large role in survival. And they showed remarkable resilience to stress, continuing to function effectively even after experiences that left others unable to fly. These characteristics made them effective in combat, but often problematic in peacetime. Many aces struggled to adapt to civilian life after the war. Some became mercenaries, selling their skills to various causes and countries during the 1920s and 1930s. Others joined fascist movements that promised a return to martial values and clear hierarchies. Some descended into alcoholism, depression, and suicide, unable to find meaning in a world that no longer needed their specialized talents. A few successfully transitioned to aviation-related careers, becoming test pilots, airline executives, or military trainers. But many found that the skills that made them successful in combat, aggression, risk-taking, quick decision-making under stress, were liabilities in peacetime occupations. The technological legacy of World War I aviation shaped military aircraft development for the next 2 decades. The lessons learned about engine reliability, weapon synchronization, ammunition feed systems, aircraft structures, and aerodynamics were all incorporated into interwar designs. But there was also a dangerous tendency to assume that future aerial combat would resemble 1918, leading to aircraft optimized for dogfighting with forward-firing guns rather than the high-speed, high-altitude combat that would characterize World War II. The tactical doctrines developed by Bölker, Richthofen, and other World War I aces remained influential, sometimes too influential, as air forces tried to prepare for the next war by perfecting the last war's methods. The human legacy was more complex and troubling. The experience of World War I aviation created a culture that glorified aggression, individual achievement, and risk-taking, while downplaying the random violence and industrial scale of aerial warfare. The aces became heroes in a war where heroism seemed impossible, individuals who could be identified and celebrated when ground combat had become anonymous mass slaughter. Their success fed myths about natural warriors, men born with special gifts that set them apart from ordinary soldiers. These myths ignored the reality that most pilots died regardless of skill, that luck mattered more than ability in determining who survived, and that the aviation war was won by industrial production and systematic training rather than individual heroism. When World War II began 21 years later, many World War I veterans returned to service as commanders, instructors, and staff officers. They brought hard-won tactical knowledge, but also outdated assumptions about how aerial combat would unfold. The technology had evolved dramatically, with aircraft speeds doubling and altitudes increasing by 10,000 feet or more. Radio communication, primitive in World War I, was now standard, enabling coordination impossible in the earlier conflict. But the fundamental challenges remained the same. Young men were still being sent into combat in machines that could kill them through mechanical failure as easily as enemy action. They still had to overcome fear, master complex skills under life-threatening stress, and somehow maintain their humanity while systematically killing other young men whose only crime was fighting for the other side. The lessons from World War I aviation that proved enduring were primarily tactical and psychological rather than technological. The importance of altitude advantage, recognized from the earliest days of aerial combat, remained valid. The value of surprise, attacking from the sun or from blind spots, continued to be crucial. The need for teamwork and mutual support within formations was reinforced by every conflict. The psychological requirement for aggression, the willingness to close with and kill the enemy, remained the defining characteristic of successful fighter pilots. These lessons, written in the blood of pilots who learned them the hard way between 1914 and 1918, shaped fighter doctrine through the jet age and into the era of beyond visual range missile combat. The mythology of World War I aces, the image of individual heroes engaging in chivalrous combat far above the squalor of the trenches, persisted despite being contradicted by the actual experience of most pilots. The reality was that aerial combat was just as brutal, random and industrialized as ground warfare. The only differences were that pilots died more quickly, their bodies weren't recovered as often, and they could at least see the sky before they died. The romance was constructed afterward by propagandists, journalists, and the pilots themselves, who needed to believe their suffering had meaning beyond serving as ammunition for the industrial slaughter machine that the Great War had become. In the final analysis, World War I aviation transformed warfare by adding a third dimension to the battlefield and creating an entirely new form of combat. The pilots who fought in the First Air War had no precedents to guide them. They invented tactics, developed weapons, and created a culture entirely through trial and error, paying for every lesson with their lives. Their achievement was remarkable, taking machines that had existed for barely a decade and turning them into effective weapon systems within 4 years of war. But the cost was measured in thousands of young men killed, tens of thousands of aircraft destroyed, and the creation of a mythology that would lead another generation to seek glory in the sky 2 decades later. The transformation from fear to legend was real, but the fear was far more prevalent than the legend suggested, and the courage required to face it was far more common than the success that made certain pilots famous.